H2O HHH. H2O. I want to give a shout out to H2O, man. I'm going to drop their website and their details in the description. They've officially become my water sponsor, and I love the fact that it's a proudly South African company. They offer water in different sizes. They also offer water containers for your office, for your organization, etc. So if you're interested in them, please reach out to them, find out how they operate. And for me, thank you so much for the water that they give to me. Keep it going, keep it flowing like the water. A couple of years ago, I made a video around banking in South Africa. And it had been spurred on by a trending topic at the time with YWBN, Young Women in Business Network, led by Ntabeleng Dikgotsi, who were looking to get their mutual banking license in South Africa. And they'd been criticized by a financial tweleb, social media influencer called Kaushik Karan. Fast forward to today, and I still hear a lot of black people in particular, South Africans in general, thinking that a black bank, a state bank, is the solution to our problems. And in that video, I explained why I don't think it is the solution. And I gave like a very generic history of banking. And today I want to do the same, because one of the things I've learned is certain education needs to be repeated over and over again, because there's constantly going to be a virgin ear, a new ear that's going to be hearing it for the first time. Why do I think that black banks are not the solution for South Africa? A bit of history. The term bank comes from banc, B-A-N-C. Could be French origin, somewhere in the Latin region, meaning a bench, bank, or a counter, bank. A lot of these would be used by essentially lenders, many of them of Jewish origin, who would sit by the harbors and they would loan money to some of these merchants and traders and ship owners. If you think about it, if you know the landscape of South Africa, we still have Baba that sit outside banks on chairs, just like those guys back then, black timers, where if you've been denied a loan at the bank, you go to them, Omashonisa, and they loan you money. So that's how banking came about. You'd hear stories of Mercutio, the money lender in Shakespeare, and Shylock. No, I think it's Shylock the Jew with Shakespeare, wanting his pound of flesh. Two important families in the history of banking. The first one being the Medici, the second one being the Rothschilds. The Medici. The House of Medici was an Italian banking family and political dynasty that first consolidated power in the Republic of Florence under Cosimo de' Medici and his grandson Lorenzo the Magnificent during the first half of the 15th century. The family originated in the Mugello region of Tuscany and prospered gradually in trade until it was able to fund the Medici Bank. This bank was the largest in Europe in the 15th century and facilitated the Medici's rise to political power in Florence, although they officially renamed citizens rather than monarchs until the 16th century. In 1532, the family acquired the hereditary title Duke of Florence. In 1569, the duchy was elevated to the Grand Duchy of Tuscany after territorial expansion. The Medici ruled the Grand Duchy from its inception until under the builder Cosimo I until 1737, with the death of Giancastone de' Medici. The Medici produced 4 popes of the Catholic Church: Pope Leo, Pope Clement, Pope Pius, and Pope Leo the 11th. Pope Leo the 10th, Pope Clement the 7th, and Pope Leo the 11th. And 2 queens of France, Catherine de' Medici and Marie de' Medici. The Medici's Grand Duchy witnessed degrees of economic growth under the early Grand Dukes, but was bankrupt by the time of Cosimo III de' Medici. The Medici's wealth and influence was initially derived from the textile trade, guided by the Wool Guild of Florence, the Arte della Lana, Like other families ruling in Italian signori, the Medici dominated their city's government, were able to bring Florence under their family's power, and created an environment in which art and humanism flourished. The Italian Renaissance was inspired by the Medici, along with other families of Italy, such as the Visconti and Sforza in Milan, the Este in Ferrara, the Borgia and della Rovere in Rome, and the Gonzaga in Mantua. The Medici Bank, from when it was created in 1397 to its fall in 1494, was one of the most prosperous and respected institutions in Europe. And the Medici family was considered the wealthiest in Europe for a time. From this base, they acquired political power, initially in Florence and later in wider Italy and Europe. They were among the earliest businesses to use the general ledger system of accounting through the development of the double entry bookkeeping system for tracking credits and debits. The Medici family financed the construction of St. Peter's Basilica and Florence Cathedral and were patrons of Donatella, Brunelleschi, Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, Machiavelli, Galileo, and Francesco Redi, among many others in the arts and sciences. They funded the invention of the piano and arguably that of opera. They were also protagonists of the Counter-Reformation from the beginning of the Reformation through the Council of Trent and the French Wars of Religion. The Medici family. The second family, this one, if you love conspiracy theories, you might know, the Rothschilds. The Rothschilds family is a wealthy Ashkenazi Jewish noble banking family originally from Frankfurt. The family's documented history starts in 16th century Frankfurt. Its name is derived from the family house Rothschild, built by Isaac Elkanan Bacharach in Frankfurt in 1567. The family rose to prominence with Mayor Amschel Rothschild, a court factor to the German Landgraves of Hesse-Kassel in the Free City of Frankfurt, Holy Roman Empire, who established his banking business in the 1760s. Unlike most previous court factors, Rothschild managed to bequeath his wealth and established an international banking family through his 5 sons, who established businesses in Paris, Frankfurt, London, Vienna, and Naples. The family was elevated to noble rank in the Holy Roman Empire and the United Kingdom. The only subsisting branches of the family are the French and British ones. During the 19th century, the Rothschilds family possessed the largest private fortune in the world, as well as in modern world history. The family's wealth declined over the 20th century and was divided among many descendants. Today, their assets cover a diverse range of sectors, including financial services, real estate, mining, energy, agriculture, and wine making. The family additionally has philanthropic endeavors and nonprofits. Many examples of the family's rural architecture exist across northwestern Europe. The Rothschild family has frequently been the subject of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. The only subsisting branches of the family are the French and British ones. It so happens that, funny enough, Africa's biggest colonizers become the British and the French. Why is the British important? Again, this is me trying to answer why black banks in the South African context are not the solution that you guys think they are. I've mentioned the Medicis. I've mentioned the Rothschilds. One of the sons would set up banks or a bank in London, England. And I want to read about it now. The Central Bank of London, also known as the Bank of England. The Bank of England is the central bank of the United Kingdom and the model on which most modern central banks have been based. Established in 1694 to act as the English government's banker and debt manager, and still one of the bankers for the government of the United Kingdom, it is the world's second oldest central bank. The bank, among other things, is custodian to the official gold reserves of the United Kingdom and those of around 30 other countries. As of April 2016, the bank held around 5,134 tons of gold worth 141 billion British pounds. These estimates suggest that the vault could hold as much as 3% of the 171,300 tons of gold mined throughout human history. In South Africa, we've got our own central bank, known as the South African Reserve Bank. The South African Reserve Bank is the central bank of South Africa. It was established in 1921 after Parliament passed an act, the Currency and Bank Act of 10 August 1920, as a direct result of the abnormal monetary and financial conditions which World War I had brought. The South African Reserve Bank was only the fourth central bank established outside the United Kingdom and Europe. The others being the Federal Reserve in America, the Bank of Japan, and the Bank of Java. The earliest suggestions for the establishment of the central bank in South Africa date back to 1879. A select committee of 10 members of parliament was established 31 March 1920 to examine the benefits to the national interest of the establishing of the central bank. Following on the recommendations of the committee, the South African Reserve Bank opened for business on 30 June 1921, making it the oldest central bank in Africa. The first banknotes were issued to the public by the bank on 19 April 1922. Unlike the Bank of England, which provided the model for establishing the South African Reserve Bank, the South African Reserve Bank is privately owned. Yeah. Okay. I've brought you back to South Africa. We have a South African Reserve Bank, the central bank, which governs all banking activity in South Africa. Our Reserve Bank has been built on a template by the Bank of England or the Central Bank of London, which was one of the banks of the Rothschilds. The Rothschilds would become a banking dynasty, having taken over from the Medici. The Medici were a powerful banking dynasty in Europe, the wealthiest family there. They came up with the double entry ledger system, which is used in accounting today. If you studied accounting, for every debit, there's a credit. They were responsible for the Renaissance, for funding artists that we celebrate today, the invention of the piano, the opera, all these things that I've mentioned. Responsible for 4 popes, for 2 queens, and they infiltrated political power across Europe. The idea that they fell could be a conspiracy theory. Did they fall or did they change surnames? Does a family just disappear into thin air when they that deep, that vast? Then you have the Rothschilds, named after the house that they lived in. Could they have been descendants of the Medici or relatives? We don't know. But essentially, I live in Johannesburg now. So I decide to have a family who are now going to be known as the people of Johannesburg. Now there are no more links to my family in the past. Mayor Amschel Rothschild will have 5 sons. He sets up a bank. He has 5 sons. They set up banks. France, Germany, England, Italy. 5 banks. The 2 prominent ones that remain are in France. We know about French colonialism, which were Burkina Faso, and they are still fighting now. And the British, of which we still have the Commonwealth nations and some countries that are somewhat still British colonies. And some even argue South Africa is still reporting to the British monarch. Cyril Ramaphosa, the president, went to visit King Charles. Our presidents before, Nelson Mandela, Thabo Mbeki, Jacob Zuma, have all gone to bow to the Queen at the time. Even the King of the Zulus has gone to bow to the Queen at a time. That's how we get here. The Bank of England is owned by the monarch, owned by England and the government there. The South African Reserve Bank is not owned by our government. It is not owned by our people. This bank that has a template from England and the Rothschilds. It has private shareholders, of which some of them are foreign. That would make you think, or at least suspect, that means maybe the British or their proxies clearly have a stake in our Reserve Bank to ensure that whatever banking activity is not controlled by whatever so-called democratic government we have here. Why is a Reserve Bank, which is responsible for our money supply, responsible for managing inflation, responsible for handing out banking licenses to banks, why is it not owned by the government that is voted for by the people? Cool. The Rothschilds would also argue, like the Medicis, that over time their wealth has been diluted but again, does a family disappear into thin air, or do they just change surnames? One of the wealthiest South Africans or South African families would be Johann Rupert, the son of Anton Rupert, second generation. Coincidence? We don't know. There's a very popular wine internationally known as Rupert and Rothschild. When they say that the Rothschilds are still in winemaking, part of that winemaking is in France, where they have banks, in South Africa, of which arguably we could say maybe Rupert is one of their proxies here. Johann Rupert, of course, the Afrikaner people being descendants of the Huguenots, the Dutch, the French, some German, etc. Do they have links to France? Because you have surnames like Dutoit, Dutoit, which are French. Do they have links? Could it be that these are descendants of the Rothschilds? Because Johann Rupert would set up a company, Richemont, which is the second largest luxury goods company in the world, as a South African. And we're proud of him, an Afrikaner, a South African, who was at the side of Cyril Ramaphosa, who had asked, Johann Rupert had asked his mate, Donald Trump, to please sit with the manager of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa. Johann Rupert was there. Very wealthy, very influential, luxury goods, business around the world. We don't know. When the British would run South Africa as a union, there would be banks established. Standard Bank, largest bank in Africa, one of the largest banks in this country. First National Bank, which at some point was owned by Anglo-American. And if you follow the history, Anglo, of course, British, American being America because that's where the funding came from. It came from JP Morgan in America, and it came from, guess who? The Rothschilds in Europe. Anglo-American, which had been set up by Ernest Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer, coming from Germany, I believe Jewish, had been funded, had taken over from Cecil John Rhodes, people like Barney Bernardo and others. History for another day. I'm drawing the links. First National Bank, Standard Bank. You'd get a Nedbank, Nederlandse Bank, Netherlands Bank, Dutch Bank that we'd have then. And then later on, other banks would come. I'm mentioning these banks because today when you look at the requirements of banking, those banks didn't need to meet those requirements when they were established, when we were still a British colony, of which we still maybe are today, and that's why there are onerous requirements to set up a bank or get a banking license today. The Afrikaners, being treated like second-class citizens in South Africa, decided to come together. They formed a secret society, the Broederbond. From the Broederbond, they then infiltrated government with the National Party. And one of the key things they did is that they set up their own bank, Volkskas, which is Afrikaans, you could argue even German. Volk, people, like Volkswagen, the people's wagon. Volkskas being folk, the people's, kas, chest, the people's chest, the people's money. A stokvel, in essence. Later on, Volkskas would merge with 4 other banks. It would be Volkskas, it would be Allied Bank, it would be United Bank, it would be Trust Bank. And these 4 banks would be known as the Amalgamated Banks of South Africa. If you take that acronym, it comes up with ABSA. Amalgamated Banks of South Africa, ABSA, the biggest retail bank in South Africa today. From ABSA, we got other banks, of course. One of them being African Bank, back in 1975. When black entrepreneurs in South Africa realized the power of banks, the power of debt, and how fundamental banks are to an economy and building enterprises, they decided to set up a union called NAFCOC for Africans, business union. And they decided to build their own bank. They went around fundraising and they raised R1 million to get a banking license. And they would eventually launch African Bank. May he rest in peace, Dr. Sam Mutsuenyane, Dr. Richard Maponya, may he also rest in peace. But Dr. Sam Mutsuenyane in particular would speak about the pain of what it took to build African Bank and how they feel like there was foul play in how they lost it. When BE would come in, one of the key BEE companies set up would be NAIL, New Africa Investments Limited. They would take over African Bank and then later on they'd sell it to a group of Jewish business people who would take over African Bank and turn it from an ordinary bank into a lending bank. Due to greed, later on, the bank would be charged with reckless lending. And instead of being collapsed, like what happened with the Vendor Building Society, which I'll speak about just now, VBS, it was saved. Saved by who? By the incumbent banks that run South Africa, the big boys. They sent a curator and they saved African Bank, and African Bank is still alive today. Where other banks that are run by black people, owned by black people, are struggling. The Vendor Building Society, as the name says, was from the vendor people. It was a mutual bank, not a standard banking license. When I speak about Tabeleng Dikgotsi and YWBN, they were trying to set up a mutual bank. They are trying to set up a mutual bank. So this was vendor people saying, we also want to have our own bank that is going to help the vendor people. Later on, links to Julius Malema, Floyd Shibambu. Floyd has joined Umkhonto weSizwe Party now, but he was under the EFF, the Economic Freedom Fighters. They would be related to some of the people that led to the collapse of VBS. But at a time when the president of the country, Jacob Zuma of the ANC political party, he would advise municipalities, go and bank with the smaller banks. You don't have to bank with these big established banks when we can empower and capacitate smaller black-owned banks. He'd get a loan there for his bond and the money that he needed to pay for the money that was looted within Nkandla, over 240 million rand looted. And when the public protector at the time, Umamuthuli Madonsela, was like, you're found guilty, you need to pay, I think it was a slap on the wrist, 7 million rand. VBS would give him the loan to pay that. But there seemed to be a lot of corruption, a lot of executives and funny people, they're looting money, buying fancy cars, taking girlfriends on trips. Very embarrassing for what is meant to be a black legacy project. And VBS collapsed. Today it doesn't have a banking license anymore. Ithala, one of the banks that would be championed by Mangosuthu Buthelezi, the Prime Minister of the Zulu nation, the advisor to the Zulu King, the leader of Inkatha Freedom Party, the person responsible for getting Ingonyama Trust land, 2.8 million hectares, to be protected under a trust with the custodianship being with the king. Ithala Bank would be a Zulu bank to help Zulu entrepreneurs to develop their areas and invest in businesses. Itala's never had a banking license. It's got special exemptions according to the Banking Act under the South African Reserve Bank. But it doesn't have its own banking license. And as of recently, it was almost liquidated. They're trying to save it now, but it's struggling. When you look up the requirements for a retail bank in South Africa, one of the key requirements is that you need to have 250 million rand in cash that is unencumbered. It is not in assets. It is not linked to investments. It does not serve as collateral somewhere. 250 million rand cash. Standard Bank, First National, Nedbank, the big banks never needed these requirements. The 250 million, which already excludes 99.99999% of all South Africans in ever even thinking of launching a retail bank, is apparently one of the easier requirements. There are regulatory requirements that will ensure that sometimes even if you get a banking license, keeping it becomes incredibly difficult. You have to abide by the FCSA, which used to be the Financial Services Board, which manages financial transactions and services. You need to register with the NCR, the National Credit Regulator, to ensure that if you're giving out credit, you fall under that ambit. And you're not involved in reckless lending like African Bank had been in before. You have to register with the Prudential Authority, the PA, to make sure that they're constantly monitoring your compliance, not just for banks, but for insurance companies and other financial services providers. They make sure that you have a certain board that ticks a certain criteria with people with certain qualifications, and they ensure that they almost give a thumbs up and a rubber stamp to the people that are meant to sit there. This is on top of the fact that you need to raise your own funding for infrastructure, buildings, branches, ATMs, paying staff, and. That is not money you're going to get from the government, and it's money you're not going to get from some of the funding agencies here.
Sorry, Pen. I think you missed Old Mutual. It also has a bank and an ATM, but they're currently trading under Bidvest.
Sure.
And they're going to get their banking license, which is going to be OM Bank this year.
Thank you. Thank you, Sia. If you, for some reason, manage to jump through all these hoops, you then have to abide by the Banks Act or the Banking Act, which is set and monitored by the South African Reserve Bank, which is privately owned, which takes its directive from the Central Bank of London, the Bank of England. We have new banks. As Usia alluded, number one, Nedbank used to be owned by Old Mutual. I think they've spun off now. Old Mutual itself, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, assets under management in South Africa next to the Public Investment Corporation, the PIC, with listings in South Africa and in, guess where? London. Old Mutual is also launching its own bank, writing off its premium payers for insurance. Discovery, Jewish-owned Adrian Gore, has also launched its own Discovery Bank, writing off its medical aid premium payers as well. Zero Bank, under Michael Jordan, who used to be the CEO of FNB at the time, would be funded by venture capitalists. Patrice Motsepe, the golden boy of Black economic empowerment, had got his own Time Bank. But Time Bank was an Australian bank. And it was only when they couldn't meet certain regulatory requirements that they gave Patrice a full share or a full holding. But the IP for Time Bank sits apparently in the Philippines, not even in South Africa. Who controls it in the Philippines? Who does Time Bank pay the money to in the Philippines? If it's not us. If anything, now there are rumors of it moving its headquarters from Mauritius. Tax avoidance, which is legal. They want to move from their Time Bank. Does Patrice own it, or is it owned by someone else? Discovery Bank, Zero Bank have got special banking licenses. Banks like Investec had to buy a banking license. They couldn't get it because of how onerous it is. Capitec, one of the biggest banks in the country today, linked to the Stellenbosch Mafia, Michael Leroux, Rian Stassen, and Yanni Mouton of PSG. They also had to buy a banking license. And black people in this country, poor people in this country, believe that getting a black bank is the solution. They also believe that having a state bank is the solution. Before he passed on, Tito Mboweni would tweet, "We need a state bank." Then he'd be called back into government to become the Minister of Finance, and then he'd go silent on a state bank. Post Bank was a state bank. The Land Development Bank of South Africa is a state bank. The Development Bank of South Africa, DBSA, is a state bank. Why were those not used to champion a state bank? You've got a bank that came from the mining industry, Ubank. It used to be Perm Bank. Supposedly a black-owned bank. Why is that not being championed? You start realizing that there is a cartel, a banking cartel, running the South African Reserve Bank in this country. Forget the governor who's a manager like Cyril, the governor Lesicha Kganyago. He's just a manager of the South African Reserve Bank on behalf of whoever the stakeholders they are. You can build an amazing bank after jumping through all the hoops and the hurdles. You will not be able to loan people that do not qualify. You have to abide by the FCSA. You have to abide by the NCR. You have to abide by the Banks Act. You have to get a thumbs up from the South African Reserve Bank, which I'd like to believe is actually influenced and controlled by the big banks, Absa, Standard, Nedbank, maybe Capitec today. So how is it ever going to help you and your people? Stokvels is how black people rebelled back in the day when they weren't allowed to engage in mainstream banking. Stokvels were used to raise money together, as I made an example with the Broeder Bond and Volkskas. Even insurance companies like Sambo, Build Together, Sanlam. These were stokvels where people were saying, let's come together and put money together and buy real assets. When you look at some of the more progressive entrepreneurs in this country, Afrikaners, of course, come together and they collaborate. They did it with Afgri, which sadly has been sold to the Americans. Grain farmers came together. They said, we need to come together, put our grains together and build a company. And they built Afgri, which was the biggest grain wholesale provider on the continent. English farmers in KZN came together milking cows, and they said, we want to wholesale our milk and then eventually retail. And they came together and they collaborated in cooperatives, and that became known as Clover. Why are we not doing that? There's an example in Bangladesh run by Professor Mohammed Yunus, known as Grameen Bank, where small groups of women who work with their hands, who sell, who retail, mama ba daisai, hawkers and the like, and he loans them money, microloans, in these mini stockpiles so that they can push enterprise. Subrata Roy would do the same in India with Sahara Pariwa, which at some point had the most employees in the world at over 1 million employees in his company. He had a Formula One team. He owned media and TV and real estate and. Stockfells. The spaza shop community in South Africa, they don't bank their money. They collect it in stockfells so that they can wholesale buy stock. And once they have enough money, then they start setting up their own wholesalers, cash and carries. A lot of the Indian vehicle sellers, dealers, they come together and they raise their money, and instead of putting it in the bank, they keep buying more and more cars, which is why their dealerships are always full of cars. That's where their wealth, their money is. The people that own spaza shops, their wealth is in stock, in the shops. Each shop might have over 1 million, 2 million rand in stock, not in the bank. So their bank becomes the spaza shop. Their bank becomes the vehicle dealership. Their bank, the Afrikaners, becomes the farm where they might have 5,000 heads of cattle. But black people believe that having a black bank, which is controlled by these powerful forces, are going to solve their problems. When they've had banks like Postbank, when they've got banks like Itala that they don't bank with, that they're not championing. And I think that somehow that's going to save them and save the concept of black entrepreneurship and build a black economy. We need to educate ourselves on how these things work so that we don't find ourselves working like Dr. Sam Mutswenyane, Dr. Richard Maponya, and the members of NAVCOC. And we watch very well-meaning leaders like Ntabeleng Dikgotsi and YWBN Mutual Bank and others trying to jump through all the hoops. They managed to raise 21 million rand, by the way, with their stockfell. Why not take that and create an investment fund and invest in small black businesses, small black female-led businesses, and let that wealth sit in trading stock, in livestock, and build real wealth on the ground. Again, I made a video about this a couple of years ago, and I just thought that it would be important to go through this education and information again. Pen you all the black pen.